Ever since the Cold War, Americans have, for the most part, been forbidden to travel to Cuba. The theory being that American tourism might in some way support the communist regime of Fidel Castro. It is a discredited theory, to be sure, yet it somehow persists. This is the first of several issues we'll discuss today with Tomas Bilbao, Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group. Welcome back. It is great to see you. Thanks very much for your time.
For having me.
If I had asked you 10, 15, 20 years ago whether this travel ban would remain in effect in 2010, would you be inclined to say, yeah, possible? Or would you be surprised?
Well, I think most people are surprised that in 50 years, despite no changes in Cuba, U.S. policy has remained the same. So I think the great question here is why the United States is actively helping the Cuban government maintain the status quo on the island.
Why do you think the tourism ban has that effect?
Well, I think that if the Cuban government, like all authoritarian systems which thrive on isolation, has spent 50 years trying to isolate the Cuban people from the rest of the world, the United States shouldn't be complicit by helping add to that isolation by prohibiting American citizens from traveling to Cuba, which, by the way, is the only country in the world where the U.S. government prohibits U.S. citizens from traveling.
Kind of outrageous that we talk so much and so vigorously about freedom, and yet the government is sort of picking and choosing where Americans may go of their own free will. After all, we're allowed to go to many communist countries with horrible, unspeakable human rights records. And to say nothing of the fact that if this was going to work, it would have worked by now. So it's as though there's a panoply of reasons why this is just kind of bogus and failed and discredited.
Well, unfortunately, it falls in line with the exceptionality of U.S. policy towards Cuba, which, frankly, is out of touch with what the United States did toward Eastern Europe when it was under communist control, and what we've done towards other countries throughout history that have successfully resulted in strong civil society and democracy. In Cuba, it seems that we tend to do the opposite of what has worked everywhere else.
There's a new push to lift the ban. Talk about that.
Well, I think what's very important is that a couple weeks ago, the House Committee on Agriculture approved legislation that would lift the travel ban for all Americans, not just those of Cuban descent, and would facilitate agricultural sales to the island. That legislation could reach the House floor as early as this month, and that would be historic because it would be the first time that the U.S. Congress moved to lift the travel ban. I think while it will clearly be an uphill battle, it stands its best chance it's had in 50 years today. So,
do you think it would be an uphill battle because of people clinging to outdated notions of, oh, it'll embolden? I mean, Castro has been in power forever. He's going to be there till he dies. His brother, I guess, is sort of really functioning as the leader of the nation with Fidel there in clearly diminished capacity because of his health problems. It is folly to think that travel has any, prop-up effect of this Castro regime. And yet you say an uphill battle when they go to count the votes?
It does for several reasons. The first of which is that there is a very strong lobby of people, including Cuban American members of Congress, who support the status quo, whose policy has been based or has been focused exclusively on hurting the Cuban government for 50 years, when in fact the strategy we should be pursuing is a strategy that focuses almost exclusively on helping the Cuban people. And in a letter that sent by 74 of Cuba's leading dissidents to Congress last month, these members of Cuba's civil society who our policy claims to support are urging the U.S. Congress to lift that travel ban.
American farmers, American agriculture really want access to this market, Cuba, and Cuba might benefit from access to American produce. Fair to say?
Fair to say. Now, U.S. agricultural industry has had access to Cuba since 2001.
Unlimited?
There are limitations on that, and certainly since 2003, when the Bush administration redefined the terms of those sales, it has made it more difficult. And so part of what the legislation that passed the Agricultural Committee last week or a week and a half ago did was redefine that language to its original intent, when Congress passed it in 2001, which would facilitate the sale of those agricultural products, and which Cuban dissidents in that same letter tell us could help them, could help relieve a lot of the ration problems that they face day to day.
Talk about the new survey that suggests that the attitude, the collective attitude of Cuban Americans toward this notion of travel might be changing in a significant way.
Yeah, well, today, the University of Miami's Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies, Dr. Andy Gomez there, a very respected Cuba analyst, released a poll that shows that 64% of Cuban Americans in South Florida support the lifting of the travel ban unilaterally by the United States. And this is in line with polls that have been done throughout the years that show that a majority of Cuban Americans support the lifting. Now, if you have the majority of Cuban Americans, you have the majority of Americans supporting it, as Gallup in a poll revealed, and you have the majority of Cuba's civil society and democracy advocates.
Plus common sense, if I may be let me throw that in there.
All right, plus common sense. So who's holding it up at this point is the question.
And so the poll, if it's perceived as valid, could have the effect of emboldening members of Congress who are thinking perhaps primarily about their own re-election chances and not wanting to offend a significant part of their electorate. If they realize the tide may be turning, that younger people, for example, might have a different take on this than folks who've been here longer, then they're free to kind of look at the issue with new eyes?
Perhaps, but I would hope that members of Congress would consider this may be a little naive, but may consider policies that are just the best policies, that are best for the American people. In this case, travel by Americans protects the rights of American civil liberties. It's in the U.S. national interest, and Cuban democracy advocates tell us that it helps their struggle inside the island.
If the ban is lifted, and I guess as a journalist I'm allowed to go now, but if the ban is lifted and any American who wants to go to Cuba can go, what would they find? Because I think a lot of us have a lot of curiosity about it, about the country, and are dying, frankly, to go. What would we find there?
Well, I think you'd find a land of contrasts. You'd find a place that is run down by 50 years of failed policies of a authoritarian communist dictatorship that's done nothing to bring any type of success or infrastructure to the country. And at the same time, you'll find Cuban people who really couldn't be any more welcoming, any nicer, and any more interested in meeting and interacting with American citizens. That's the irony of our policy, is that the Cuban government has spent 50 years creating an image of the U.S., to blame the U.S. as a scapegoat for all of its failures. And instead of allowing American citizens, who are the best ambassadors for the U.S., to go and dispel those rumors, we limit their rights to travel to the island. And that's part of the argument that the defenders of the status quo use. Well, right now European and Canadian tourists can go, and that hasn't changed Cuba. Travel in itself will not cause Cuba to become a democracy tomorrow. However, Cuba has not spent 50 years demonizing Europe or Canada. It has done so for the United States.
In the time we have left, talk to us about the recent release of dissidents.
It's a very, very important step. The news came out last week that the Catholic Church in Cuba, which had been working as a mediator for the last couple of months in trying to get the Cuban government to accede to some of the demands of Cuba's internal dissident movement, mainly that they release political prisoners, at least or especially prioritizing those who are in very grave health conditions. And so the Catholic Church was able to secure a commitment apparently by the Cuban government to release 52 political prisoners who remained in jail from the mass jailing of the spring of 2003. So it's a very, very important development. Remains to be. It's not an ideal situation because many of those, or most, if not all, of those political prisoners will be forced to leave the country and go to Spain. Now we're hoping that those who have chosen not to will be allowed to live, stay in Cuba outside of jail together with their families. And we have to recognize that after those 52 are released, there will still be another 100+ political prisoners in Cuban jails. Nonetheless, it's very important, and I think the main takeaway from this is that the prisoners were released, the political prisoners were released, not because of pressure from the Catholic Church or pressure from the European Union. Certainly there was. but it is mainly a response to increasing internal pressure by Cuba's democracy advocates, Guillermo Fariñas, the ladies in white, Orlando Zapata Tamayo. Those are the true people who deserve the recognition for the release and the announcement last week.
We have only a minute left, maybe a little less. To the extent that you can generalize, why were these people jailed in the first place?
Because the Cuban government didn't like the fact that they stood for democracy and human rights. It's an authoritarian communist system, and that's what American tourists would have to recognize. They'd be visiting a country where all personal rights are violated by the Cuban regime.
Every day.
Every day.
Tomas Bilbao is Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group. It is always good having you here to discuss these issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate it.
Always good having you here.